Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is the Casual Friday podcast. In this week's podcast, I have a couple of finished projects. I have a new project that's part of my long-term project to understand the evolution of socks and stockings. This one is from the 1940s. And I'll be talking about what I'm planning to work on during Finish It February. So let's get started. I do have one tidbit before we get started. I am going to be a guest on the Woolpatch show this Sunday. The Woolpatch show is a live YouTube show hosted by Stuart of the Woolpatch, which is a yarn and fabric store in England. It'll be live. It'll be at 8 p.m. in England, and it will be 2 p.m. my time here in the Central Time Zone in the US. So that's 3 p.m. on the East Coast and noon on the West Coast. And if you're somewhere else in the world, you're going to have to look it up. So he chats a bit about what projects he's working on. He has a little quiz question that he does, and then I'll be talking to him. We're going to be talking about left-leaning decreases and kind of the history of them, as well as doing some live demonstrations. So I hope you can join us on Sunday, January 21st, 8 p.m. GMT or 2 p.m. Central Time. We'll see you there. I finished my Royale sweater that I started back in November, I think right before Thanksgiving. I did the first sleeve, then I put it to the side for a few weeks, and then I picked it up, did the body and the second sleeve. So 2 weeks ago, I showed you that I had all the pieces finished, and I finally sewed the sleeves in this morning so that I could show it to you guys. So it really helps me to sometimes have these deadlines. Otherwise, I'd wait till February every year to do any of my finishing. So let me show you the sweater, and I'll tell you a little bit about it. I'm going to stand up, and I will probably be headless, but you'll be able to get a good look at the sweater. So this is the sweater. It's called Royale with an E at the end. It was designed by Glenna C. probably 12, 13 years ago. I've had the pattern that long. It's been in my queue forever. And I finally decided to knit it. It's meant to be worn with no ease or even slightly negative ease, unless of course your preference is different than that. So that's how I knit it. And it has a waist shaping in it, but you don't have to do the waist shaping if you don't want that. You could shape it however would fit your body. It's got this modest scoop neck. They have one that's much deeper that you'd have to wear a t-shirt under. It comes way down. This is a little lower, and let me scooch down. This is lower than I would typically wear in the winter because it gets so cold here, but it works out okay. It's a worsted weight yarn. I use Cascade 220. I think the colorway is called something like Razzleberry. I'll leave links down below to the pattern as well as information about the yarn color. These traveling twisted stitch patterns are some of my favorite things to knit. I love cables and texture patterns, and the intricacy that you can get with these traveling twisted stitch patterns is incredible. A lot of people associate these with Japanese stitch patterns, and they do incorporate those, but these are stitch patterns that are very traditional in like Bavaria, in Austria, and like the northern Italy area. These were stitch patterns that were used in stockings back then in their national costume. One of the things about them is that because the stitch patterns are traveling, so the cable patterns that travel usually have 2 or 3 knit stitches that are in a rope, and they travel across a background of pearls. These are single knit stitches, but they're twisted, so they're knit through the back loop, and those are what are traveling. And so in these traditional patterns, you can often have something traveling. On every round, there will be stitches traveling. And because they're so delicate, you often have many, many panels, and they're all different. So there's a lot to keep track of. What's nice about these stitch patterns is that they only travel every other round. I don't know, say it's the even round. That's when you're going to have things travel if they travel. Sometimes the stitches will go straight up and they don't cross or travel at all. But there will be an alternate round where everything is just worked as it presents. That makes it really nice when you're working a sweater like this, where once you get to the armhole and the neck, you are working pieces flat. And so it makes it really nice that you're not having to cross stitches on the wrong side of the work. You just have to work the knits as knits and work the purls as purl through the back loop, because that's the back side of the knit through the back loop. But I am really happy with this. I like the way it fits. The sleeves are close fitting without being too tight. It fits me well. I like the color. I really like it. It's been a pleasurable process. As I mentioned, I started this back in November, but it didn't take me 2 months to knit this. It's been 2 months since I started this. So I always keep spreadsheets when I start a project. It helps me keep track of my stitch counts. I keep track of when I finish one ball and start another, so I can get an accurate idea of how much yarn I'm actually going to use with the project. So if I think I might be short, I can always get it fairly quickly, maybe get the same dye lot. In the case of this sweater, in my size, the yardage requirement would mean that for the Cascade 220, I would need like 6.1 balls of yarn or skeins of yarn. So I had to buy 7 because you can't just buy, a tenth of a ball. And in the end, I only needed 5, like right to the end. Like I have maybe a couple of yards left of that 5th skein, but I didn't even need to go into the 6th skein, never mind the 7th skein. So now I have two skeins of that left over, and I have 2 other skeins of that same color, but in a different dye lot that I had bought years ago. I'd bought 4 skeins of that, I think, and I used 2 of them for this zipper neck that I knit recently. So I have a lot of that yarn still, 4 skeins worth, but 2 different dye lots. Now, the one problem I found with the pattern was that there were some places where shaping rates were incorrect. Like they were calling for working 1 extra decrease than was really necessary for the stitch counts to work out. There was an issue with the sleeve and like where they were having you and when they were having you bind off. It was not quite right. So if you are looking to knit this sweater from this pattern, I would suggest looking at my project notes, because I do have some bullet points about where there were some errors. But it's a really well-designed sweater, and I really enjoyed knitting it, but just be aware that there are a few numbers here and there that might not be quite right. So a while back, I started a pair of socks. I wanted something easy to work on when I was at knitting groups. And I chose a sock that had actually a pretty challenging start to it, one that I really had to focus on. And once I got past the toe, it was a toe-up sock, the rest of it was really easy, and I could take it to knitting group and I could just work on it, whenever. And I finished that first sock very quickly. But then I had to start the second one. Again, I had that challenging start, and it was never the right time to start it in a knitting group. So I finally got started, and then I zipped through that second sock. So let's go to the overhead and I will show you the completed pair. This is a project that I saw somebody on Reddit do, and a lot of the comments were, oh my God, I can't look at that. It makes me sick and whatever because of the spinning. And I thought those are really cool. I'm always looking for something interesting in terms of construction or technique, particularly with socks. So the sock pattern that this is called Tipsey Toes. It's a free pattern. It's on a blog post, and I will leave a link down below in the show notes. I always leave links to the patterns and the yarn I used, etc. This yarn I actually bought at Knitters Guild garage sale this past summer, and it's really old. It took me a while to find any pictures of this colorway so that I would understand what it would look like, because it predates Ravelry. The toe is actually a wedge toe. So a wedge toe is shaped like this. If you're knitting cuff down, you would be doing decreases on each side of the instep and the sole every other round until you had about 1/3 of the stitches left, and then you would graft it across. If you were doing toe up, you'd start with a closed cast on. You could use Judy's Magic cast on, you could use a figure 8 cast on, you could use a Turkish cast on. And then you would do increases every other round on either side of the instep and the sole until you had your full stitch count, and then you'd work straight. What this sock does is it creates the wedge toe sideways. So here's the upper straight part. Here's one of the angles, and then this curve is really the other angle. And the way it starts is you start with your closed cast on, like Judy's Magic cast on, and then you increase, but you increase at different rates on each half. On this half, or on this side, on both the instep and the sole, you are increasing every round. And up here, it's every other round. And so when you finally get to the stitch count that you need to do the next part, what you are doing is short rows. And so those short row wedges are creating the extra length over here. And then once you're done with the wedges, then you continue straight on up to the heel. So she is calling for a short row heel. I think she was calling for German short rows, but you can use whatever you want. But I have to do a couple of things before I can even do a short row sock heel. I have to create a gusset. It's going to be hard to see because I did it when I had this dark yarn here, but I have to increase stitches before I can start the heel. And that's because on my foot, the circumference, from the heel to where the leg becomes the instep and around, that circumference on me is very long compared to my ankle measurement. So I have a very high arch, and that causes my instep to be higher, and that means that this diagonal ends up being higher. So I need a deeper heel than normal, and then I need something that's longer here. So I do increases and to create more stitches on the heel side, and that means I have to do more short rows, which makes it deeper, but having more stitches also makes this circumference bigger. And the way that I do German short row sock heels, when I start the first half of the heel, rather than going all the way across the stitches and working my first double stitch over here and then working all the way back and doing my first double stitch over here, I stop short one stitch on each side. And then after I get to the center, then I work my longest short row back and forth, and then I work the second half of the heel. And that's because I really don't like working double stitches. And I also don't like working 2 rounds in the middle of the heel, especially with the self-striping sock yarn. I have a video on these various techniques. The one, like, how do you know how much to increase? I have a series of videos that help figure that out for short row heels and peasant and afterthought heels. Then I have a video on 3 different ways of working German short row sock heels, including the method that I've talked about here. So I'll leave those links down below. For the leg, it's just straight up, and then you have to bind off. And this is always the tricky part of a sock, is having a cast on or bind off that is stretchy enough. And I need something that is as stretchy as the knitting itself is, because this circumference around my foot is the largest circumference that my sock has to go around. It's larger than my actual calf is up here. So I need something that can get past my heel. And so what I use is the half hitch bind off. It is a type of sewn bind off. There are at least 3 types of sewn bind offs. This one replicates the smooth side of a long tail cast on. So this is a really interesting sock pattern. She did come out with another version of this sock pattern later, and that one has short row wedges on the legs too, so that you will have a wedge that is thin here and thick here, and then it will be thin here and thick here. So if you like that kind of challenge or difference in sock construction, you might enjoy that. I personally, like knitting in the round when I'm knitting socks, which is one reason I don't typically use a short row heel. For me, having to knit back and forth while I'm knitting a sock kind of defeats the purpose of, one of the purposes of why I'm knitting a sock. But I did think this was really interesting. So I will try these on and see if I can get them, both my feet, on camera for you. All right, let me get both of my feet up here. Okay, so you could wear them on either feet. But the idea is that they are mirror images of each other. And the way you do that, you start both socks exactly the same, and it isn't until you get to the heel that you just choose one side to do the heel on in the first sock, and then in the other sock, you do it on the other half of the round, and then that will make these mirror images of each other. They fit just fine, and I've only washed them. I soaked them once. Once I wear them, the little corners that you get right here with a wedge toe, those are going to go away. I also have feet that are very conducive to wearing a wedge toe, so they work pretty well for me. This week I wanted to get back to my long-term project of knitting socks and stockings from different eras to understand the evolution of them. So previously I've done stockings from all these different centuries that had different constructions, but I wanted to turn to a 20th century sock, particularly one from the 1940s that I got from this book. So the sock pattern I'm using is this one. The instructions for it are like, it has a basic heel flap and gusset construction, but what is interesting about this book is that toward the back they have this 2-page spread called the Aladdin Sock. And they have instructions. It's just a basic stockinette sock so that you can learn how this works. And the idea is that the heel flap and heel turn are replaceable. And it's marked with this contrasting yarn so that when you need to replace it, you know where the separation should be. You remove that contrasting yarn, you can rip back the heel to the top and re-knit it and then graft it again. You can use a contrasting yarn again to sew it if you plan that you're going to be replacing it again in the future. And then they also have you graft the toe shut with the contrasting yarn. It makes it a little easier when you want to, if you want to re-knit just the toe, to find where that is so you can snip that out and then more easily rip everything back. They aren't using this heel in any of the sock patterns in here. They're just introducing this as a choice that you can make. I have another sock book from Paytons and Baldwin's, the Beehive collection. So in this booklet, they have something called Beehive Innovation. And what it is a way of knitting the sock sideways. So the majority of the leg and the instep are knit sideways, which allows you to do like vertical stripes in different colors. And then you knit like this T-shaped back to it. So you knit ribbing down the back of this, and then you do your heel flap and heel turn. And they have you use the Aladdin heel for that so that it will be replaceable. And then you finish knitting the sole, and then you work the toe in the round, and again you have this toe woven in with contrast yarn. But even for socks that are just knit in the round, they're using that that same trick. They're using the Aladdin heel, and they refer to the back. And back here they have a smaller spread explaining it. And they're only demonstrating one method. There are actually 3 variations for how you can do this. That was part of what I wanted to explore, was a couple of the different variations. So they're always talking about it's patented. So they even say Paytons and Baldwin's Limited welcome the use of this invention by persons knitting socks by hand with Paytons and Baldwin's yarn. Other persons should not use or imitate this invention without first obtaining a license in writing from Paytons and Baldwin Limited. So they're like, this is patented. You can't write your sock patterns using this. They don't even want you using other people's yarns and using this technique. They can't go after anyone. They could go after someone who published a pattern, but they're not going to find an individual person. So I wanted to knit a sock with this heel. So I wanted something that was kind of interesting to knit, but that was fairly plain, like a solid color. I will be doing some Intarsia stuff. I don't think I'm going to do an Argyle. They were very popular then, but I've done Argyle socks before. I had to do one do a pair as part of the Master Hand Knitting program. So that wouldn't be new to me in terms of understanding construction or technique, but there are some other really cool patterns that I will want to do. But in order to understand this Aladdin heel, I just wanted a sock that was otherwise constructed like normal, not the Innovation one, not something with color work that would require seaming up the back, but just a plain sock in the round. So I am using one of the main technique, the one that's called preferred in the patent, to knit this heel. And I use contrast yarn for the toe as well. The second sock is not going to be a match to this one. This is what's called regulation length. It's 11-inch leg. So the part that's actually patterned is over 64 stitches. And the ribbing is over 72 stitches. And so this part will come up to like where a regular mid-calf sock comes up to. And then there's 8 additional stitches that are done in ribbing that come up the calf, which I thought was a clever way of doing shaping. I'm going to try that on a sock that would actually fit me. This is a sock to fit a man. That's why I can put it on this foot form, and I need something a bit smaller to fit me. So I used slightly more than 50 grams. So I had to break into the second 50-gram ball of sock yarn in order to finish this because it was so long. So the second one will be what's called slack length. So it will be like 6.5 inches in length. And then I would use one of the other techniques for creating this heel to see which one I like better. I will do some kind of a technique video in the future based on these instructions, and I have some ideas about how to make things easier or to modify things, but I just need to work through the process first and kind of see what I think. Like for example, one of the things that they specify is that when you finish working the heel, you work all the way across in contrast yarn, and then they want you to come back to the middle, because that's really the beginning of the round, and begin working with your regular yarn. When you sew up the sides, they want you to use a different length of contrast yarn over here and over here. And I thought, well, that ends up being a lot of ends to have to weave in. Here, I wonder if you graft it and you just leave a really long tail, if you can then just use that really long tail to sew up this part here. And I did that on one side, and it's a little tricky at that corner. And when I did it on the other side, I haven't tightened this one up yet, I could see where having separate lengths could make more sense, where it'd be a little easier to close up that corner. Having something grafted and then trying to seam something together and managing the tension in that corner is a little tricky. So, there's a trade-off between, eliminating tails and getting a nice finish right here. So that's why I want to work through all of this, and I want to try the other technique, or one of the other techniques that they have. There's a third one that I'm like absolutely not going to do that. So sometime this spring I will do a video on replaceable heel flap and gusset construction, because it is something that many people would like to have. I do think that this is an interesting construction. It's worth knowing about and sharing it. It's been a fun thing to learn as part of my exploration of the evolution of stockings and socks. Finish It February starts in just a couple of weeks. Many people use Finish It February as Fix It February or Frog It February, or all three. You can use it however you want. If you don't have any UFOs or unfinished objects in your knitting bag, then Finish It February, in terms of your knitting projects, may not be appropriate, but you may have other crafts or other things in your life where Finish It February makes sense. Finish It February starts really in January by pulling out all of your unfinished objects, picking each one up one by one and saying, do I still love this? Do I like this? Do I want to finish it? Am I going to enjoy knitting it? If so, it goes in the yay pile. If you pick up something and you hate it, you don't like it, you don't feel like you ever want to finish it, you're not going to want it when it is finished, whatever the reason, that goes into the nay pile. And then there's the pile of ambiguity. Sometimes you have these projects where you really don't know how you feel about them, and you really have mixed feelings. You don't have to make a decision about those yet. And I'm going to be talking about that pile of ambiguity in a couple of weeks once Finish It February is finally underway. What I want to talk about today is that nay pile, and what do you do with those projects, those unfinished projects that you don't like? One thing that you can do is throw it away. Some people are going to gasp in horror at that. They think that's the worst thing that you could possibly do. But it doesn't matter what other people would think. It matters what you would think. Would you feel better about throwing it away or not? Some people really like the fabric that they produce, but maybe it turned out that this was too small and it wasn't going to fit. But you just can't bear to rip it out because you just love the fabric that you created and you want to turn it into something else. You can do that if that appeals to you. It never appeals to me because a lot of times the suggestion is, you have the body of a sweater and you're like, this isn't working out. And somebody will say, you should turn it into a pillow. I don't have decorative pillows in my house. It's not something I use. I wouldn't enjoy turning that knitting into a pillow. So for me, that's not an appealing solution, but it might be for you. A couple of years ago, there was somebody participating in Finish It February who was in that situation. I think it was his first stranded colorwork project, and his gauge ended up being tighter than he had anticipated, but he loved what he had created. And so he set about figuring out what he could make out of this fabric that he had created. He made a hat, he made a scarf, he made a number of different things using that stranded color work, turning it into things that maybe that had seams in it, but piecing things together. And it was really creatively fulfilling for him. And it was amazing to see what he had done. That's just not something that I would do. I would rather just start something completely new. That's me. That said, there are things that I still have where I have the fabric that I've knit, but I haven't ripped it out. I haven't thrown it away. I haven't donated it. I haven't done anything with it. I just returned it to my stash. So that yarn is available to me if and when I want to use it at some point. And the reason I prefer to do that is because frogging it is more work. And I've already decided I'm not putting any more work into that project. So I'm just going to put it on the wall. And it could be someday I come across a project where I'm like, oh, that would be a great use for that piece of knitted fabric that I have, like making a pair of felted mittens. Like you can felt the fabric, cut it out, and make a pair of mittens out of it, for example. So a lot of times I'm just sort of hedging my bets in the off chance that someday I will come across a project idea that would be perfect for that situation, rather than trying to figure out now, what am I going to do with this, and spending a lot of time and energy trying to figure that out and coming up with something that maybe I'm not that crazy about. So it just depends on where you get your creativity and your excitement from, how you want to handle that. Some people are going to want to just frog everything. If they're not going to finish it, they want to frog it and they want to wind all the yarn up and put it back in their stash. And if that's the way you are, you should do that. Me personally, I don't want to spend my time doing that until I'm ready to use the yarn. But there is an exception. A few years back, I was knitting something at a time when I was like really kind of emotionally upset about what was going on in the world at the time. And I was throwing my creative energy into designing a sweater and I really liked it, but then I needed to put it to the side for a while. And every time I looked at it, I kept feeling that negative emotion that I was feeling at the time that I was creating it. I finally decided a couple of years ago I was going to frog it. And so as I was winding it, I just, held it up and I attached it to my ball winder and I just wound it off. And as I was watching those stitches disappear, I just felt so much better. You never know how you might want to deal with that particular project, because how I dealt with that project is not how I deal with my unfinished projects in general, like the ones that I don't actually want to finish. So a couple of other options. Corey Eichelberger, she goes by iRock Knits. She's a designer. She's local here to the Twin Cities. She, a few years ago, started this, what does she call it? The Knit Exchange. And I will leave links down below, where you might have an unfinished thing that you don't want to finish and you don't want to, you know, rip it out or donate it to Goodwill or whatever. And so you can find somebody who either might want to buy it and finish it themselves. Maybe they want the project, or maybe they just want the yarn, or maybe you want to trade with somebody. Or maybe you just want to give it to somebody who would like it. You don't care about money. You just want it to go to a good home. And you know that you're not going to use that yarn and you don't really want to finish that project. It could be anything like that. So that's another option. And then I also mentioned you could just donate it. You could bag it up. You could put the pattern in it if you wanted and donate it to a charity shop or Goodwill or something like that. And there are a lot of knitters who go through Goodwill looking for yarn and things like that. And sometimes people go specifically looking for unfinished things that they can finish. So it just, you never know. So pick one of those, and it could be something different for each one of those particular projects. The first time I went through all of my projects like that, I had two of them. I didn't even know, it was like awful. I didn't like the yarn, and it was whatever it was. I threw them, I broke the yarn and threw it away. And then there was one where I knit this little hat and then all of these garter stitch pieces in different colors, and they were supposed to be rolled up in a certain way and turned into roses and leaves and then sewn onto this little baby hat. And it was my dental hygienist who had told me about that hat. She would knit tons of them for baby gifts. And I thought, well, that sounds like fun. And I knit the pieces and I'm like, I do not want to do this, rolling it up. And so I bagged that all up in a Ziploc. The next time I went to my dentist appointment to get a dental cleaning, I said to her, Judy, you can say no. Do you want this? This is one of those little hats. All it needs is to be put together. And she thought about it. She's like, I think that would probably take me one evening to do. Sure, I'll take it. And because I kept saying, you can say no. But she said yes. And so I wasn't pushing it on her, but I thought this is one project that would be really cute, and I don't have anybody to give it to. I just wanted to knit it for fun. And she thought she might be able to use it. So that worked out. So there are a lot of different ways to deal with your nay pile during Finish It February. So now I want to go to the overhead and I will show you what I am going to be working on for Finish It February. Some of it is fixing things and some of it's finishing things. Finish It February for me is not just about finishing things, it's also about fixing things. So sometimes I'll put new buttons onto something. If I've lost one, I might put elbow patches onto something. I might re-knit a neck if I didn't like the neckline, various things. In this case, I'm going to be fixing this sweater. There's a big hole right here. This is a sweater. This will be no surprise to anyone that this was knit in the late 80s. I knit it for my nephew, who was probably 4 years old at the time. And I think my niece wore it maybe after a couple of years later. Then my nephew's kids wore it, and now it's time to pass it on to my niece, but there's this hole in here. My brother asked me last fall if I could fix this, and I said yes, and he sent it to me. He wondered if I still had any of this yarn, and I said absolutely not. It's been 35 years. I do not have it. But it just seemed like a blue that I would have in my stash. Like I might not have this yarn weight. Like this is probably a DK or more likely worsted weight if I knit it when I got back here to the US. But, you know, I could always double, you know, a couple of strands of sock yarn or something. But I have, you know, a lot of different blues and none of them are the right color. I did think about visible mending, but I just didn't think that was something I wanted to do for this particular sweater. If it was a plain sweater or I don't know, there's something about, there's already a lot of color and they're going in all different directions. And I didn't want to add yet another color that didn't already appear in here. So I really wanted to see if I could find something matching and just repair it and, you know, make an invisible fix. I was at Harriet and Alice. It's a yarn shop here in the Twin Cities, not too far from me. I went in last Sunday for a knitting group and I thought I'm going to see if they have anything that will work with this. And they did. They had this yarn here. Now this is a kettle dyed yarn. It's Arcania, I think. Araucania. So it's kettle dyed sock yarn. So I will have to double it. And yes, it's got other colors in there, but I don't need a ton of this and I can pull that out of here and I will have enough left to make a pair of socks with. It's not going to take very much yarn here. So the technique I will be using to fix this is called Swiss darning. And so if you think of duplicate stitches tracing over existing stitches, Swiss darning is basically like that. Often you can use it if things are thin, and so you use the duplicate stitch not as an embroidery technique but as a repair technique. So I'm going to be using that. I'll have to set up a little framework in which to create these stitches and connect them. But I think that will work really well. So this will be my fixing project for Finish It February. The next thing I want to do is finish spinning this wool. I had a whole bunch of this. I've spun a bunch. Some of it I spun into yarn already. I had 2 braids of these that I bought during Tour de Fleece back in July. And I spun it up and turned it into yarn. And I loved it so much. It was exactly what I wanted that I decided to buy more of the braids and then knit a sweater's quantity. So so far I've got, you know, a bunch of bobbins that I have spun up. I haven't plied this yet. So I have a few braids. I don't know how many more. So I want to finish spinning that up, do all of the plying and have the yarn. And this will be my first hand spun sweater. Obviously not knitting that during February, but I do want to get the spinning done. So Tour de Fleece got me back into spinning. I fell off the wagon when we went to the Netherlands and then I got COVID and I haven't gotten back into spinning. And so Finish It February is a perfect time for me to do that. It's like time to do that. Longtime viewers will remember that a few years ago, I was working on a long-term project to knit a sweater from each decade, from the 1890s to the 1990s. And during that time, I found out that in the 60s and 70s and even into the 80s, there were these sweater kits that you could buy that would have a pattern in it, and it would have all of the yarn you needed to make the sweater. It would have buttons and grosgrain ribbon that coordinated with it. And then it would also have a skirt length of hand-woven wool fabric. So this is hand-woven in the border counties of like England, Scotland. So this is a full complete kit. This one actually had a couple of different patterns in it. And I used one of those patterns to knit a sweater from one of the other kits that did not have a pattern in it. I will put that sweater on the screen. So it was this blue sweater, and then the coordinating fabric is this right here. So this skirt length of hand-woven fabric is 28 inches wide, and I think it's 1 3/4 yards in length. So it has to have side seams and then a zipper up the back. And I thought, well, this is a good time for me to get back into sewing. I hadn't been sewing much at all for years. I pulled my sewing machine out at the beginning of COVID to make masks. And I thought, you know, things have changed since I was last sewing. There are YouTube videos and online resources, and I could actually learn something about sewing rather than just getting a pattern and following the instructions. That's how I cook. That's how I sew. That used to be how I knit until I did the Master Hand Knitting program. And I wanted to just learn more about like sewing. And I took some Craftsy classes and another online class, and I learned to draft my own skirt pattern based on my measurements. And I made, so I did a couple of different classes, and I did different muslins or mock-ups or toiles, whatever you want to call it, from a couple of different sources. But then it was time to make this skirt, and I chickened out. I chickened out because this fabric, I mean, this is all there is. If I screw it up, there isn't anymore. I felt that it probably needed to be lined, and I didn't know how to do pattern matching. I'd never had to do that. I always had just prints that I would sew with, and so I never had to do that. So I kind of backed off. And the other thing I was concerned about was that, well, this muslin is so thin and this fabric is thicker, and what if in the whole dart situation, like this particular muslin has 2 darts on either side on the front, and they're very tiny, and you know, I felt like maybe 1 dart was better, and also I wasn't sure it fit me right, and if it didn't, how do I adjust it? I know you can't. That's the purpose, is that you can adjust it, and I didn't know what to do. So I signed up for a sewing class. The first class was yesterday. Next Thursday is a skip week. So my second class will be on February 1st. But I went yesterday, and I brought with it this fabric, but I also brought with it some plaid flannel that I want to use as a mock-up. And so the owner of the store is the one teaching the class, and so she showed me how to do pattern matching, because it was not intuitive at all to me. Like, I didn't understand how to do it. And then when she showed me how it worked, I thought, this is the most amazing, genius thing ever. So that's what I really wanted from that class, was being able to work on my own project and then ask an expert when I got stuck with something, and to be able to work on it. I will work on my mock-up between now and my next class, and if I'm feeling confident, I will cut out the fabric for this one. So I'm really excited about this. So I'm finally going to get this skirt done. For all of you who've been wondering about it and have asked me every once in a while, are you ever going to finish that skirt? The answer is yes. I'm going to finish it in February. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video, or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.